On the morning of October 16, 1869, two hired men named Henry Nichols and Gideon Emmons were digging a well behind the farmhouse of William Newell, a farmer in the town of Cardiff, New York, a few miles south of Syracuse. 3 feet down, a shovel struck something that was not soil and was not any stone either man recognized. They kept digging. What came up over the next several hours was a human figure lying on its back, carved from grey rock, 10 feet and 4 inches from head to heel. The face was fixed in an expression the diggers would later struggle to describe to reporters, somewhere between agony and sleep. Newell put a tent over the pit before the day was out and charged the first curious neighbor a quarter to look. Within a week, the price was 50 cents. Within a month, the road to Cardiff was clogged with carriages, and a farmer's well-digging accident had become the most talked-about discovery in the United States. Newspapers as far as Boston and San Francisco ran it on their front pages. Ministers cited it from the pulpit as physical confirmation of the 6th chapter of Genesis, the verse that reads, "There were giants in the earth in those days." Nobody outside the small circle who had helped bury it a year earlier knew that the giant in Newell's pit had never been anything but a rock. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The man who built it was named George Hull, a cigar maker from Binghamton, New York, and Newell's first cousin. Hull was not a sculptor and not a scientist. By his own later account, he was an atheist who had spent an evening in 1867 arguing with a traveling revivalist preacher over whether the Bible's giants were meant to be read as literal history. Hull decided to give the argument a body. In the summer of 1868, he traveled to Fort Dodge, Iowa, and purchased a block of gypsum from a quarry there, telling the quarrymen he wanted it carved into a monument to Abraham Lincoln. He shipped the block by rail to Chicago under a false name and hired a stonecutter named Edward Burghardt to carve it into a reclining giant, paying him under a promise of secrecy. Burghardt and an assistant spent months on the figure. They set steel knitting needles into a block of wood and hammered thousands of small pores into the stone's surface, then treated the finished skin with sulfuric acid and an ink wash to dull the fresh-cut gypsum into something that looked like it had spent a long time in the ground. The finished giant weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. In November of 1868, Hull had it shipped by rail and wagon to his cousin's farm in the middle of the night and buried it himself, 3 feet down, in the exact spot where Newell would later claim he needed a well. The wait was deliberate. Hull needed the disturbed ground to settle and the cut surface to weather before anyone dug it up, and he needed a full year to pass so that no one would connect a load of stone delivered to a quiet farm with a giant discovered by accident. When Newell finally hired Nichols and Emmons, he already knew exactly what they would find and exactly how far down to look. Word of the discovery reached New Haven within days, and a Yale paleontologist named Othniel Charles Marsh traveled to Cardiff to see the figure himself. Marsh was already, at 38, one of the most respected fossil scientists in the country, and he spent less than an hour at the site. He noted fresh tool marks, still visible in the recesses of the carving, chisel strokes that had not had time to weather. He noted that gypsum is soft and water-soluble, and that a genuine 10-foot figure left in damp New York soil for any real span of time would show erosion the Cardiff Giant simply did not have. He gave his opinion to reporters before he left the farm. He called it, in a phrase the papers repeated for weeks, a most decided humbug. The scientists who visited after him reached the same conclusion by the same route, reading the tool marks and the surface treatment as the work of a modern hand. None of it slowed the crowds. If anything, the argument sold more tickets. A showman named P.T. Barnum offered Newell $50,000, an enormous sum for 1869, to lease the giant for 3 months. Newell and Hull, who had by then quietly formed a syndicate to run the attraction, turned him down. Barnum's answer was to commission his own plaster copy from measurements and photographs and put it on exhibit in New York City under a sign declaring that his was the genuine article and the one still standing in Cardiff was the fake. Newell and Hull sued Barnum for defamation on the theory that he had called their fraud a fraud. The case never reached a real verdict. A judge reportedly told the syndicate that if they wanted the court to rule Barnum's copy the fake, they would first need to swear under oath that their own giant was real. Neither man was willing to make that claim in a room where perjury had consequences. The suit fell apart before it went anywhere. By December, public sentiment had turned decisively toward Hoax, and in February of 1870, George Hull gave a full confession to reporters, later printed in the Chicago Tribune, walking through the gypsum block, the carving in Chicago, and the burial on his cousin's farm in exhaustive, almost proud detail. What makes the Cardiff Giant unusual is not that it turned out to be false. Most sensational discoveries from the 19th century eventually do. What makes it unusual is how loudly the correction arrived. Marsh's verdict ran in the same newspapers that had carried the original discovery inside the same news cycle. Hull's confession ran on a front page, under his own name. The giant did not vanish into an institutional vault the week it was found. It stayed exactly where it was, still charging admission, its own exposed fraud now as much a part of the show as the carving itself. A hoax debunked in public, just as loudly as it was announced, turned out to be the exception. Most of the giants that followed it were not. Cardiff had proven something to newspaper editors that nobody needed to say twice. A giant skeleton sold papers. Through the 1870s and into the early 1900s, similar stories surfaced with almost mechanical regularity, usually in late summer, when hard news thinned out, and editors needed something to fill the front page before the fall session of Congress, or the harvest reports gave them real material. Journalists at the time had a name for that stretch of the calendar. They called it the silly season, and giant skeletons were its most reliable crop. A paper in one town would report bones pulled from a burial mound, 7 feet, 8 feet, occasionally 9, sometimes with an elongated skull, sometimes with a double row of teeth, always without a photograph, always attributed to an unnamed professor or an expedition that had already left town by the time a reader might think to write in and ask. The stories rarely named an institution that could actually be checked, and when they did, the institution named most often was the Smithsonian, borrowed for credibility from 1,000 miles away, with no expedition, no correspondence, and no accession record behind it. Some ran once and were forgotten within the week. Others were picked up by wire services and reprinted in a dozen papers before anyone at the originating paper could confirm or retract them, which in most cases nobody ever tried to do, because there was no institution and no professor to write back to. George Hull did not stop at Cardiff. In 1877, working again in secret, and this time with Barnum as a willing partner rather than a rival, Hull built a second giant, later known as the solid Muldoon, out of a hardened mixture of mortar, ground bone, blood, and meat, poured into a mold and left to cure into something that looked, from a few feet away, like petrified flesh. He had it buried outside Beulah, Colorado, near Pueblo, and arranged for its discovery by a prospector that September. The newspapers ran the story almost exactly the way they had run Cardiff 8 years earlier, and for a few weeks Hull and Barnum split the admission money from a tent show built around the new giant. This time the unmasking came faster. A geologist examined a chipped fragment, found no cellular structure of any kind, and identified the mixture within days of the exhibit opening. The solid Muldoon never approached Cardiff's fame, but it proved the method was repeatable. The same man who built the first giant built a second one on almost the same playbook, and the same newspapers that had been fooled once printed the correction just as readily the second time. Wisconsin's own mound country did not escape the pattern. The state's effigy mounds, built by late woodland communities between roughly 700 and 1200 years ago in the shapes of birds, bears, and long uncoiling water spirits, had already drawn a different kind of myth-making decades before any giant story reached them. In 1836, a surveyor named Othniel Charles examined a large fortified site on the Crawfish River in what is now Jefferson County, and named it Aztalan, on the belief that it marked a waypoint for the Aztec people on a legendary migration north. The Aztec connection was never real. The site's actual builders belonged to a Mississippian culture community with no demonstrated tie to central Mexico at all. but the name stuck, and it fed the same appetite the giant hoaxes would later feed. The idea that Wisconsin's earthworks were too sophisticated to have been built by the ancestors of the people already living in the region when European surveyors arrived. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The actual Smithsonian response to the giant question took 10 years, and it never once involved seizing a skeleton in the dead of night. In 1879, Congress folded the study of Native American archaeology into a new Bureau of Ethnology under the Smithsonian, led by the geologist John Wesley Powell. Powell understood that the mound builder question, whether the earthworks scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and up into Wisconsin had been raised by a vanished race of giants, or by the ancestors of the native peoples still living on or near that land, had become more than an academic curiosity. It was being used, explicitly, in political and legal arguments about who held a rightful claim to that land. Powell assigned the investigation to Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist by training who had turned to archaeology in his 50s. Starting in the early 1880s, Thomas and a small team of field assistants opened, measured, and catalogued more than 2,000 mounds across 21 states, cross-referencing skeletal remains, pottery styles, tool types, and burial customs against the documented practices of Native American nations living in each region. The work was slow, unglamorous, and almost entirely unreported in the daily press, because a stratigraphic survey does not sell papers the way a 9-foot skeleton does. Thomas published his findings in 1894 in a document titled Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, running to more than 700 pages. Its conclusion was unambiguous. The mounds were built by the direct ancestors of Native American peoples, in stages over many centuries, using tools and burial customs continuous with practices the Bureau's own ethnographers had documented among living native communities. The mounds held no lost race and no vanished superior civilization. In more than 2,000 sites, Thomas's team found no giants, only the ordinary skeletal remains of ordinary people, with the usual scatter of individuals taller or shorter than average that any large sample of human remains produces. The report ended the mound builder myth as a live question inside professional archaeology within a decade of its publication. It did almost nothing to slow the newspaper giants, which kept appearing in the back pages of small dailies for another 30 years, because Thomas's 700 pages never got a headline, and a debunking rarely travels as fast or as far as the claim it corrects. The giants kept appearing anyway, because they were never really about archaeology in the first place. A giant skeleton pulled from a mound did two things a stratigraphic report never could. It gave a small town's newspaper a story that competitors 100 miles away would have to reprint, and it gave readers a reason to believe that whatever built the mounds in their own backyard must have been something other than the people whose descendants were, in many of those same decades, being pushed off land through treaty violations and forced removal. The giant story and the mound builder myth were never separate phenomena. The myth supplied the motive, treating Native American communities as recent, minor tenants on land actually built by someone greater and long gone. The giant stories supplied the proof, manufactured fresh every silly season, printed without a name that could be checked, or a bone that could be measured twice. Cyrus Thomas understood exactly what he was arguing against, and he said so plainly in his own introduction, noting that the vanished race theory had done real work in justifying the treatment of native nations as strangers to their own history. His report is still in university libraries today, still available, still exactly as unambiguous as it was when it was printed. It is also, by any honest measure, one of the least read 700 pages in the history of American archaeology, because a government report correcting the record does not travel the way a sensational headline does, and it never has. Almost none of the giant skeletons reported between 1870 and the 1920s survive in any museum or archive today, and that absence is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence that most of them were never physical objects to begin with. A real skeleton, however large, leaves a paper trail, an accession number, a curator's initials, a shipping manifest, a photograph taken by someone with a professional reputation to protect. The Cardiff Giant, a fraud from the moment George Hull buried it, left all of those things, because a hoax built to be examined up close has to hold up to examination, and its builders wanted the scrutiny, since scrutiny sold tickets. The newspaper giants left almost nothing, because they were never built to be examined. They were built to be read once, believed for an afternoon, and forgotten by the next edition. The Cardiff Giant did not disappear either. After Hull's confession, the original figure passed through a series of owners and exhibitions, was displayed at fairs for decades with its own explained fraud, as much of the draw as the object itself, and eventually came to rest at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, where it remains on public display today. Visitors can walk up and look at the tool marks Othniel Marsh identified in 1869, the same fresh chisel strokes that gave the whole thing away within a week of its unearthing. The museum does not call it a suppressed discovery. It calls it, plainly, on the placard beside the case, one of the most successful hoaxes in American history, and it invites visitors to see exactly how the trick was built. Nothing about the giant needed to be hidden, because nothing about it, once examined, was mysterious. The mystery had only ever lived in the narrow window between the digging and the diagnosis, before anyone with the right training had bothered to look closely. That is the real difference between the Cardiff Giant and the hundreds of unnamed giants that followed it in small-town papers over the next half-century. Cardiff got its scrutiny within days, because Marsh was a real scientist with a real reputation, sent to a real farm that anyone could visit, to examine an object that anyone could still go stand in front of. The newspaper giants almost never got that. By the time a scientist with the right training might have thought to ask for a photograph or a specimen, the story had already run its course, the paper had moved on to next week's copy, and there was nothing left to examine, because in the overwhelming majority of cases there had never been anything to examine in the first place. Suppression requires an object. Most of these stories never had one. The well outside Cardiff, New York, is still there. William Newell hired 2 men to dig it in October of 1869, already knowing exactly what they would strike 3 feet down, because he had helped bury it there himself the previous November. Nothing about that story required a government to make it disappear. The giant was fake from the moment George Hull commissioned it, real only in the sense that 10 feet and 4 inches of carved gypsum genuinely sat in a hole in the ground, and genuinely fooled a great many people, for a period of roughly 2 months, until someone with the training to notice fresh tool marks took an hour to look closely, and said so in print under his own name. The version of this story that would circulate a century and a half later in towns across Wisconsin and Ohio and a dozen other states dropped the middle part. It kept the giant, it kept the mound, it kept the vague, unnamed authority arriving to take the evidence away. What it dropped was the part where somebody actually checked, published the check, named himself, and let the public see exactly how the trick worked. That part was never suppressed. It ran on a front page in 1869, and it sat in a 700-page government report in 1894, both still sitting on shelves anyone can walk into and read today. The giants were never hidden from anyone. What got lost was the correction, not because someone buried it, but because nobody found a 9-foot skeleton anywhere near as interesting as the truth. That ordinary human habit, remembering the claim and forgetting the correction, turned out to be a far more durable kind of vanishing than any warehouse in Washington could have managed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.